The acrid air burned her lungs with each desperate breath. Alara pressed her back against the crumbling concrete wall, the rough surface scraping through her threadbare jacket. Her fingers tightened around the rusted pipe, her only weapon. Useless, probably, against the men who hunted her, but the weight of it brought a fleeting comfort. 20 years of life in this wasteland had taught her one immutable truth: trust nothing, especially not other humans. 6 sets of footsteps echoed through the abandoned building. Heavy boots on broken tiles. Methodical, unhurried. They knew she was cornered. Come out, little bird." A gravelly voice called, its false playfulness sending icy fingers down her spine. "We only want to talk." Alara bit her lip to keep from making a sound. She knew exactly what talking meant to men like these. The scavenger group had been tracking her for 2 days since she'd stumbled upon their territory. In this world, trespassers weren't warned. They were examples. Her mind flashed to Mira, the only friend she'd made in the years since her family was torn apart. Myra's body had been left displayed at the territory border, a silent warning to others. Alara had been 14 then, traveling with a group that had seemed safe until they weren't. The leader had sold information about their route for extra rations. Half were killed in the ambush. The rest scattered. Now, alone again, she prepared for the inevitable. The footsteps stopped. A hushed conversation, then the sound of debris being kicked aside. "I can smell your fear." The voice was closer now. "It's intoxicating." Alara's hand trembled. She could run, but the only exit led right to them. She could fight, but she was outnumbered and weakened from days without proper food. Or she could make her death mean something. Take at least one of them with her. Decision made. She gripped the pipe tighter and prepared to swing. A shadow fell across the narrow space where she hid. A tall figure blocked what little gray light filtered through the broken ceiling. Alara lunged forward, pipe raised. The blow never landed. With impossible speed, the figure caught her wrist mid-swing. Alara expected crushing pain, but instead, the grip was firm yet restrained. Not crushing her bones, merely stopping her attack. For a heart-stopping moment, she stared up into eyes the color of a storm-washed sky, gray with hints of blue. Not the bloodshot, hungry eyes she expected from her pursuers. He was tall, painfully thin like everyone these days, but with a wiriness that spoke of hidden strength. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, disappearing into a dark beard. His clothing was odd. Not the mismatched, scavenged garments most wore, but something more uniform, almost military in its practicality. The man placed a finger to his lips, then pointed upward. Above them, footsteps moved across what remained of the second floor. "Must have gone deeper," a voice called out, different from the one that had taunted her. "Check the basement access." The stranger released her wrist and gestured silently to a section of wall Alara had assumed was solid. But as he pressed against it, a narrow opening appeared. A service passage she hadn't noticed. Trust nothing, especially not other humans, her mind screamed. But the alternative was facing the hunting party alone. The man slipped into the passage and extended his hand back toward her, not grabbing, not commanding, simply offering. His eyes held no malice, no hunger, no calculation that she could detect. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The footsteps were returning. 2. 1. Alara took his hand. His fingers wrapped around hers with surprising gentleness, guiding her into the darkness. The passage was claustrophobically narrow, forcing them to move sideways, chest to chest at times. She could feel his heartbeat, steady, controlled, while her own threatened to burst through her ribcage. After what seemed like an eternity, the passage widened into what must have once been a maintenance room. Faint light seeped through a grate in the ceiling, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. "They won't find us here," the man whispered, his voice surprisingly soft for someone his size. "Not immediately, at least." Alara immediately backed away, pipe raised again defensively. "Who are you? What do you want?" The question came out hoarse. How long had it been since she'd spoken to another person? "My name is Kale," he replied, maintaining his distance. "And right now I want to live. Same as you." Those men, Are they after you too? No. His eyes flicked toward the ceiling. But they work for someone who is. Ilera studied him, trying to make sense of this impossible situation. No one helped strangers in this world. No one risked themselves without expecting payment. Why did you help me? She demanded. Kale regarded her for a long moment. You were outnumbered. It wasn't a fair fight. Fair. The word tasted. Foreign on her tongue. Nothing is fair anymore. Maybe not, he conceded, but some of us still try. A crash from above interrupted them. Voices shouted commands, growing angrier by the minute as their search proved fruitless. We need to move, Kale said. There's a way out through the old sewer line. It'll take us beyond their patrol route. Us. Ilera's grip tightened on her weapon. I never agreed to go anywhere with you. True. He moved toward another narrow opening at the far end of the room. You're free to stay or find your own way out. But those men will keep searching, and they have more patience than you might think. Without waiting for her response, he squeezed through the opening and disappeared. Ilera stood frozen, weighing her options. The hunting party above would eventually find this room. Going back was suicide. Following a stranger might be too, but at least it bought her time. Cursing under her breath, she followed. The sewer system was a maze of partially collapsed tunnels and fetid water. Kale moved with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route before, occasionally extending a hand to help her over debris or across particularly treacherous sections. Each time he touched her, Ilera flinched, but he never commented on it, never lingered longer than necessary. They emerged into the dying light of evening nearly a mile from where they'd entered. The sky was a toxic amber, the sun a diffuse glow through perpetual haze. Before them stretched the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving metropolis. Now, just concrete carcasses picked clean by scavengers in time. We should find shelter before dark, Kale said, scanning the horizon. The radiation storms are worse at night. Ilera knew he was right. The storms had grown more frequent in recent years, sudden downpours of rain so acidic it could burn through clothing, carrying radioactive particles from the wastelands to the north. There's an old subway station 2 blocks east, she offered reluctantly. Underground section is mostly intact. Kale nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her knowledge. Lead the way. They walked in silence, maintaining a careful distance from each other. Ilera kept Kale in her peripheral vision at all times, watching for any sudden movements, any sign that his unexpected mercy had been a ruse. But he simply walked, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, posture alert but not threatening. By the time they reached the station, the light had faded completely. The entrance was partially blocked by a collapsed billboard, creating a narrow crawl space that would be easy to defend and difficult to spot from a distance. Inside, the air was stale but less caustic than above ground. The platform level was littered with evidence of previous occupants, charred spots from long-extinguished fires, discarded packaging, a child's shoe missing its sole. But it had clearly been abandoned for some time. This will work, Kale said, dropping his pack in a corner that offered a clear view of both the entrance and the tunnel beyond. You have good instincts. Necessity, Ilera replied flatly. She chose a spot against the opposite wall, maintaining maximum distance while still benefiting from the safety of their shared space. From her own pack, she withdrew a thin thermal blanket, one of her most valuable possessions, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Kale produced a small light source, not a harsh electric torch, but something that emitted a soft blue glow, barely enough to illuminate their immediate surroundings without attracting attention. Are you hungry? He asked, offering a foil-wrapped package. Ilera's stomach clenched painfully. She couldn't remember her last proper meal, but accepting food meant owing something. No, she lied. Kale's expression didn't change. He unwrapped his own portion, what looked like a dense protein bar, and broke it in half. He ate one piece, then placed the other halfway between them on a clean section of his pack. In case you change your mind, he said, then turned his attention to checking what looked like a homemade communication device. The silence between them grew thick with unasked questions. Ilera fought against her exhaustion, determined to keep watch on this stranger who defied everything experience had taught her. But her body betrayed her, eyelids growing heavier as the adrenaline of the day's events faded. "Sleep," Kale said without looking up. "I'll take first watch, so you can slit my throat." The words came automatically. Now he did look up, his expression impossible to read in the dim light. "If I wanted you dead, I would have left you for those men." Logic, but not necessarily truth. Still, Alara's body demanded rest. "Wake me in 4 hours," she said, knowing she would likely wake at the slightest sound anyway. For hours, he agreed. She curled on her side, back to the wall, facing Kale with her hand never far from her pipe. Despite her determination to remain vigilant, sleep claimed her almost instantly. In her dreams, she ran through endless corridors, pursued by shadows with hungry eyes. She was searching for someone, a face she couldn't quite remember, a voice that called her name from somewhere just beyond reach. As the shadows closed in, a hand extended from the darkness. She reached for it, fingers straining. Alara jolted awake, disoriented and gasping for breath. "Just a dream." Kale's voice came from nearby, steady and calm. "You're safe." Safe. Another foreign concept. She sat up, wiping cold sweat from her forehead. "How long?" she asked. 3 hours, he answered. "I was about to wake you." A small lie, she suspected, but not one worth challenging. Outside, rain began to fall, hissing as it struck the concrete above them. The acidic smell crept in even here. Storm started, Kale observed. "We'll need to wait it out." Alara nodded, her mind already calculating. Storms usually lasted 6 to 8 hours. They would be trapped together in this small space until morning at least. "Where were you headed?" Kale asked. "Before those men started hunting you." The question seemed innocent enough, but Alara hesitated. Information was currency, sometimes more valuable than food or medicine. "Nowhere specific," she finally said. "Just away." Kale nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sometimes away is the best destination. "What about you?" she countered. "You said someone was after you." A shadow crossed his face. "Yes." "Who?" "People who want something I took from them." "And what was that?" His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where something bulged beneath his jacket. "Their future." It was a cryptic answer that explained nothing, yet Alara sensed it was also the truth. The realization was unsettling. She was accustomed to obvious lies, not enigmatic honesty. "You should eat something," Kale said, changing the subject. The half-protein bar still sat untouched between them. Alara's hunger had become a physical pain she could no longer ignore. With a reluctant movement, she reached for the offered food. "Thank you," she said stiffly, the words unpracticed. Kale simply nodded and returned to his silent vigil. The protein bar was better than anything she'd tasted in months, dense with nutrients and carrying a hint of sweetness that seemed impossible in this bitter world. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. As she ate, she studied Kale more carefully. His clothing, while worn and patched in places, had once been high quality, the kind manufactured before, not cobbled together after. His equipment was similarly advanced, including the communication device he continued to monitor periodically. Military, perhaps, or government. Both had ceased to exist in any meaningful way years ago, but there were rumors of remnants, specialized units that had gone underground with stockpiles of pre-fall technology. "Were you a soldier?" she asked suddenly. Kale looked up, surprise briefly visible on his face before it was smoothed away. "What makes you ask that?" "The way you move. Your equipment. The fact that you've clearly been trained for something." A faint smile touched his lips. "Observant. Necessary," she repeated her earlier response. "I was something like a soldier," he admitted after a pause. "Though my battle was fought in laboratories more often than fields." "A scientist, then?" "That was unexpected. Most pre-fall intellectuals have been the first to go, too specialized for the brutal practicality of survival. Unless you worked on the catalyst," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The catalyst, the bioengineered virus that had been deployed in the final days of the resource wars. Designed to target specific genotypes, it had mutated beyond control, decimating populations indiscriminately before burning itself out. What followed, Environmental collapse, social disintegration, the radiation storms had merely finished what the catalyst had begun. Kale's silence was confirmation enough. Alara stood abruptly, pipe in hand. You helped create this hell. No. His voice was firm but not defensive. I was part of the team trying to stop it, to find a cure after it was released. And did you? The question came out as a bitter accusation. Kale's hand moved again to his chest, to whatever he carried beneath his clothing. Not in time to save what was, but perhaps enough to ensure there will be a future. Alara wanted to dismiss his words as lies, but something in his eyes, a haunted knowledge, a burden carried too long, made her hesitate. You should rest now, she said instead. I'll keep watch. To her surprise, Kale nodded and settled against the wall, though she noticed he positioned himself so he could still see both her and the entrance. Trust, it seemed, was in short supply on both sides. The rain continued through the night, providing a constant soundtrack to Alara's thoughts. She tried to reconcile the man sleeping across from her with the apocalypse that had shaped her entire life. He would have been young when it happened, perhaps just starting his career. Did that absolve him of responsibility? Did his claim of working on a cure rather than the weapon itself matter? More importantly, could she trust him to lead her safely away from this place? Or was she merely exchanging one danger for another? By the time gray light began to filter through the entrance, Alara had reached no conclusions. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the familiar post-storm miasma, a thick humidity that carried metallic particles which settled on skin and clothing. Kale awoke silently, transitioning from sleep to alertness without the disorientation most experienced. Another soldier-like trait. The hunting party will have moved on by now, he said, gathering his few possessions. Storm would have washed away our trail. Where will you go? Alara asked, surprising herself with the question. Kale studied her for a moment. There's a research facility hidden in the northern mountains. What's left of my team is waiting there with the equipment needed to complete our work. The northern territories are dead zones, Alara said, remembering travelers' tales of landscapes so irradiated that exposure meant certain death within days. Most are, Kale agreed, but there are pockets protected by geographical features, deep valleys, cave systems, places where the worst of the fallout couldn't reach. It sounded like a fantasy, the kind of hope that got people killed. Yet Kale spoke with the certainty of someone who had seen these places with his own eyes. What about you, he asked. Since away isn't specific enough anymore. Alara had been asking herself the same question all night. She had survived this long by avoiding others, by treating every encounter as a potential threat. But that existence had become increasingly precarious. Resources were growing scarcer. The radiation storms more frequent. Lone survivors like herself were becoming rare. I don't know, she admitted finally. Kale nodded as if he'd expected this answer. You could come with me, at least part of the way. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1 in the wastes. The offer hung between them, unexpected and complicated. It wasn't friendship or even alliance, merely a practical arrangement. Yet it represented something Alara had avoided for years, dependency on another human being. Why would you want me along? She asked, suspicious of motives she couldn't yet see. Because you've survived this long on your own, he replied simply. That means you're capable, resourceful, and I suspect you know these territories better than I do. It was true. Alara had spent years mapping safe routes, identifying which areas to avoid and which might yield valuable scavenging. That knowledge was her most precious possession. We can travel together until the foothills, she said finally. After that, we go our separate ways. If Kale was disappointed by this limitation, he didn't show it. Agreed. They emerged from the subway station into a world washed clean by acid rain. The ever-present dust had been temporarily settled, leaving the ruins with an almost pristine appearance that belied their decay. In the distance, the shattered spires of the financial district caught the morning light, glass fragments glittering like fool's gems. North is through the old industrial zone, Alara said, orienting herself. 3 days walk to the foothills, if we don't encounter trouble. Kale adjusted his pack. Then we should hope for an uneventful journey. In this world, such hope was luxury bordering on delusion. But Alara kept that thought to herself as they set out into the wasteland. The first day passed in watchful silence. They moved efficiently, communicating with gestures more than words. Alara led them through half-collapsed buildings and dried-up canal beds, avoiding the wider streets where visibility made them vulnerable. Kale followed without question, occasionally suggesting minor adjustments to their route that Alara had to admit made strategic sense. By nightfall, they had reached the outer edge of the industrial zone, a labyrinth of factories and warehouses that had once churned out the products of a consumption-obsessed civilization. The chemical plant ahead is unstable, Alara warned as they sought shelter for the night. Tremors trigger reactions in whatever was left behind. Light sounds attract scavengers thinking it's other survivors. Kale nodded. We'll give it wide berth tomorrow. They found refuge in an administrative building with intact interior rooms. After securing the perimeter, Kale produced another of his protein bars, again breaking in half and offering a portion to Alara. This time, she accepted without hesitation. How did you survive the initial outbreak? Kale asked as they ate. You would have been very young. The question probed too close to memories Alara kept locked away. My parents protected me, she said curtly, until they couldn't anymore. Kale seemed to sense her reluctance. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. What about you? Alara deflected. How did a scientist survive when most of his kind didn't? Something like shame flickered across Kale's features. We were warned. Not all of us, just those considered essential to recovery efforts. You were evacuated while everyone else was left to die. Alara translated bluntly. Yes. No excuses, no justifications. Just acknowledgement of a truth she hadn't expected him to admit. And now you're trying to make it right? The question held more curiosity than accusation. Kale's gaze met hers directly. Can anything make this right? The honesty in his response was disarming. Alara had encountered every variation of denial and self-justification from survivors, but never this simple acknowledgement of an irredeemable past. No, she answered, but that doesn't mean nothing matters anymore. A ghost of a smile touched Kale's lips. Precisely. The moment of understanding between them was so unexpected that Alara felt suddenly vulnerable, as if she'd revealed too much. She turned away, busying herself with arranging her meager bedding. I'll take first watch tonight, she said, needing to re-establish distance. Kale accepted this with a nod, settling down with his back against a wall. Within minutes, his breathing had slowed to the steady rhythm of sleep. Alara watched him in the dim light of his blue-glowing device. In sleep, the hardness left his features. The scar on his face seemed less a mark of violence and more a symbol of survival. His hands, capable of swift action as she'd witnessed during their escape, rested open and relaxed. She tried to reconcile these observations with her deep-seated distrust of all survivors, especially those who had been part of the power structures that had failed humanity so completely. It would be easier if Kale fit neatly into the category of enemy. His complexity was uncomfortable. The night passed without incident. Morning brought with it the copper taste of approaching radiation, warning of another storm within the next day or two. We should move quickly, Alara said as they prepared to leave their shelter. Find higher ground before the storm hits. They traveled faster than the previous day, taking more direct routes despite the increased exposure. The industrial zone gradually gave way to what had once been suburbia. Endless rows of decaying houses, their uniformity now broken by collapse and the reclaiming efforts of stubborn vegetation. By midday, they had covered more ground than Alara had expected. The foothills were visible on the horizon, hazy through the perpetual atmospheric contamination. We could reach the base of the mountains by tomorrow evening, Kale observed. If the storm holds off, Alara agreed. As if in answer to this optimism, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the unmistakable electrical charge that preceded the worst type of radiation storm. Alara felt the hairs on her arms rise. We need shelter, Kale said, scanning their surroundings. Now, the suburban landscape offered few options. Most structures had been stripped of anything useful, including the materials that might have protected against radiation. There, Elara pointed to a partially collapsed school building. Schools had often been built as emergency shelters in the pre-fall era. This one might still have intact basement levels. They ran as the sky darkened to a sickly green. The wind picked up, carrying dust particles that stung exposed skin. By the time they reached the school building, the first lightning strikes were illuminating the clouds with unnatural purple flashes. The main entrance was blocked by debris, but a side door hung from a single hinge. Cale forced it open wider, allowing them to slip inside, just as the first drops of contaminated rain began to fall. The interior was a maze of collapsed ceilings and crumbling walls. Elara led the way, navigating toward where emergency shelter signs still pointed with faded arrows. The basement access was partially blocked, but a narrow gap remained, just wide enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. "You first," Cale insisted, glancing back at the increasingly violent storm visible through broken windows. Elara hesitated only briefly before lowering herself into the darkness. Cale followed, dragging a fallen metal shelf over the opening to provide minimal protection from the rain that was now finding its way inside. The basement was surprisingly intact, a large open space with reinforced walls and only minor leakage from the ceiling. Emergency supplies had long since been scavenged, but the structural integrity remained. "This should hold," Cale said, examining their surroundings with the aid of his light. "The storm might last through the night." Elara nodded, trying to ignore the creeping claustrophobia that came with being trapped underground. They settled in opposite corners of the room, establishing their temporary territories as they had in previous shelters. But as the storm intensified above them, Elara found herself moving closer to the center of the room, away from the increasingly damp walls. Cale did the same, until they were sitting just a few feet apart, close enough to share the dim light between them. "You're shivering," Cale observed. Elara hadn't noticed, but now she felt the tremors running through her body, not from cold, but from a deeper exhaustion that seemed to have caught up with her all at once. Without a word, Cale removed his outer jacket and offered it to her. When she hesitated, he simply placed it on the ground between them, just as he had done with the food. "It's lined with radiation-resistant material," he explained. "Better protection than your current gear." The practical benefit overrode Elara's instinctive reluctance. She took the jacket and draped it over her shoulders, immediately feeling the difference in quality. It was warm in a way her scavenged clothing never managed to be. "Thank you," she said quietly. Something in her tone must have conveyed more than the simple acknowledgement of the jacket, because Cale looked at her with a question in his eyes. "For helping me," she clarified, "with those men. You didn't have to." "Neither did you," he replied. "You could have gone your own way afterward." It was true, yet somehow the option had ceased to feel viable after that first shared night. Not because she trusted Cale completely. She didn't, but because something about his presence had disrupted her carefully maintained isolation. "What is it that you're carrying?" she asked suddenly. "The thing those people want." Cale's hand moved to his chest in that now familiar gesture. After a moment's hesitation, he reached beneath his shirt and withdrew a small cylindrical container suspended from a chain around his neck. "This contains the only viable sample of the countermeasure we developed," he said, holding it so the blue light illuminated its metallic surface. "A biological agent designed to neutralize the lingering effects of the catalyst in human DNA." Elara stared at the unassuming object. "A cure." "Not exactly. The damage that's been done can't be undone. But this could prevent further deterioration. And more importantly," he paused, seemingly weighing how much to reveal, "it could ensure that future generations don't inherit the genetic damage, that they're born free of the catalyst's effects." The implication was enormous. The catalyst had corrupted human genetics at a fundamental level. Most children born after the fall carried mutations that resulted in shortened lifespans, compromised immune systems, or worse. If what Cale claimed was true, why are you telling me this? Elara asked, suddenly wary again. Such information made her a target by association. Because I'm tired of carrying this burden alone, Kale admitted, a weariness in his voice that hadn't been there before. And because you deserve to know what you're risking your life to travel with. The honesty was unexpected and disarming. Alara found herself wanting to offer something in return, an equivalent vulnerability. My parents were doctors, she said, the words emerging before she could reconsider. They ran a field hospital after the initial outbreak, treated everyone they could, regardless of whether they could pay or trade for it. Kale remained silent, sensing there was more to the story. It got them killed, Alara continued, the familiar pain dulled by years but never absent. A group came, demanded all their supplies. When my father refused to stop treating a child to deal with them, they shot him. My mother tried to reason with them. They shot her too. I was hiding under a cot. They never saw me. How old were you? Kale asked softly. 8. The memory surfaced with visceral clarity. The sound of gunshots, the metallic smell of blood, the absolute silence that followed as she remained frozen in her hiding place for hours, afraid to move even after the killers had gone. I waited until dark, she continued, the words coming easier now that she had started. Then I gathered what supplies I could carry. I ran. I kept running for years. And never stopped, Kale observed. Alara looked up, meeting his gaze. Would you? After seeing what people are capable of. I've seen both the worst and best of humanity, Kale replied, often in the same people. A crash from above interrupted their conversation, part of the school's structure giving way under the storm's assault. Dust and debris rained down through cracks in the ceiling. Instinctively, they moved closer together, away from the worst of the falling material. When the collapse subsided, they found themselves sitting side by side against the center support pillar, the safest spot in the increasingly unstable basement. We should rest while we can, Kale suggested. The storm won't pass until morning. Without the defined territories of their previous arrangements, the question of how to position themselves became suddenly complicated. After a moment's awkwardness, they settled with backs against the pillar, facing opposite directions so each could watch one half of the room. Despite the uncomfortable position, exhaustion soon claimed Alara. She drifted into a fitful sleep, punctuated by the ongoing sounds of the storm and the occasional settling of the building above them. She awoke sometime later to find that she had slumped sideways in sleep, her head now resting against Kale's shoulder. She jerked upright, embarrassed and instinctively defensive. It's all right, Kale said, his voice gentle in the darkness. The blue light had dimmed to conserve power, casting just enough glow to make out his profile. You needed the rest. Sorry, she muttered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. Don't be. There was something in his tone, a softness she hadn't heard before. The storm continued to rage above them, but within their shelter, a different kind of tension had developed. Not the wariness of strangers, but the uncertain awareness of two people beginning to see each other as more than temporary allies. You should try to sleep more, Kale suggested. I'll keep watch. Alara knew she should protest, should insist on taking her turn. But for the first time in years, she felt the weight of constantly being on guard lifting slightly. Just for tonight, in this temporary haven, perhaps she could allow herself this small surrender to trust. Wake me if anything changes, she said, settling back against the pillar. I will, Kale promised. This time, when sleep claimed her, no nightmares followed. Only darkness, and the unfamiliar sensation of not being entirely alone. Morning brought relative quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind its usual aftermath of contaminated puddles and debris-strewn landscapes. The school building had suffered further damage, but the basement remained secure enough for them to have weathered the night safely. They emerged cautiously, surveying the changed terrain. The storm had altered the landscape, washing away landmarks and creating new obstacles. But the mountains still loomed on the horizon, somehow closer looking in the post-storm clarity. We can reach the foothills by nightfall if we push hard, Kale said, studying the path ahead. Alara nodded, a strange reluctance settling in her chest at the reminder of their agreement. The foothills marked where they would part ways. Just days ago, She had been counting the hours until she could return to solitude. Now, the prospect filled her with an unfamiliar emptiness. They traveled in silence for most of the day, picking their way through storm-ravaged terrain. The physical demands of the journey left little breath for conversation, but the quality of their silence had changed. It was no longer watchful and tense, but companionable, the quiet of two people comfortable enough with each other to not need constant reassurance. As the land began to slope upward and the first true hills appear before them, Alara found herself intentionally slowing their pace. Kale matched her without comment, seeming equally reluctant to reach their destination. They made camp in the shelter of a massive fallen highway overpass, a concrete arch that formed a natural windbreak. As Kale prepared their meager dinner, Alara stood at the edge of their shelter, watching the sun set behind the ruins they had traversed together. "It will be strange," she said without turning, "traveling alone again." Kale joined her, maintaining the small distance that had become their custom. "It doesn't have to be that way." Now she did look at him, searching his face for hidden meaning. "What are you suggesting?" "Come with me to the research facility," he said simply. "Your knowledge of the territories could help us navigate more safely. And once we arrive—" He hesitated. "If the countermeasure works, we'll need people who understand survival in this world to help distribute it." It was a practical offer, framed in terms of mutual benefit rather than emotional connection. Yet Alara sensed the unspoken sentiment beneath it. "And if it doesn't work?" she challenged. "If your colleagues are gone, or the facility has been compromised?" "Then at least we tried," Kale replied. Together. Such a small word for such a monumental concept. "I need to think about it," she said finally.